You ever hear a story that sounds so simple on the surface? You think you know how it ends before it even begins? A down-on-his-luck rancher, a smoky saloon, a desperate gamble. You've heard it 100 times. But this one ain't like the others. This is the story of Eli Turner, the Silver Creek Ranch, and a girl with wolf eyes who walked out of the shadows of Deadwood and set the whole damn territory on fire. And it starts like so many stories of ruin and redemption do, with a deck of cards. The air in the Silver Ace Saloon was thick enough to chew, a foul stew of cheap whiskey, cigar smoke, and the sweat of desperate men. Eli Turner stood at the poker table, the worn felt beneath his fingers seeming to absorb the last of his hope. Across from him sat Clay Rohr, a man who smiled like a snake oil salesman and had the eyes of a hangman. Eli was broke. Not just down on his luck broke, but soul deep, canyon empty broke. His ranch, Silver Creek, was dying of thirst. The cattle were bone thin, the fields were dust, and the bank was circling like a vulture over a fresh kill. His wife, Rosalind, hadn't said a word, but he saw the fear in her eyes every morning, a fear that gnawed at him worse than any hunger. So here he was, in a place no respectable man would be caught dead in, betting the last of his pride against a man who'd sell his own mother for a counterfeit dollar. "Turner," Rohr drawled, his voice a slick poison. "Heard the cattle are looking as grim as your card face." Eli ignored him, his jaw set like granite. "What's the buy-in?" Rohr's smile widened. "High stakes tonight, friend. $500. Eli's stomach plummeted. He didn't have 50, let alone 500. He turned to walk away, the taste of failure bitter in his mouth. "But," Rohr purred, stopping him cold, "for an old acquaintance, there's a side wager." He snapped his fingers. From the darkest corner of the saloon, one of his thugs dragged a figure forward. It was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 13, all sharp angles and grimy clothes. Her hair was a tangled mess, and a fresh bruise colored her cheekbone. But it was her eyes that stopped Eli's heart. They were cold, calculating, and ancient. They weren't the eyes of a child. They were wolf eyes, filled with a defiant fire that seemed to burn right through him. There was no fear in them, only contempt. "This is Clarabelle," Rohr said, as if presenting a prize steer. "A little street rat who owes me a debt she can't possibly repay. So, she's collateral. You win the hand, you win the girl. A strong back for your failing ranch. You lose, well, you were leaving with empty pockets anyway." A sick feeling coiled in Eli's gut. Gambling for a human being, for a child. It was a line he'd never thought he'd cross. But then he saw Rosalind's face in his mind, the thought of losing their home, the only thing they'd ever built together. He was a drowning man, and Rohr had just tossed him a stone, telling him it was a lifeline. He looked at the girl again. She met his gaze unflinching. That wolfish stare held him, and for a second he felt like he was the one being judged. He looked at his empty pockets. He looked at Rohr's smug, predatory grin. He looked back at the girl, pride, desperation, and a sudden inexplicable feeling that this was about more than just a card game. It all crashed down on him at once. "Deal the cards," Eli said, his voice a low rasp. The game was 5-card draw. The room went quiet, the only sound the soft click of the cards on the felt. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He picked up his hand. A pair of jacks. Decent, not great. He could bluff, but Rohr could smell a bluff a mile away. The betting went around. Eli threw in the deed to a useless patch of land he owned, a bluff in itself. Rohr just smiled and raised. The final draw came. Eli discarded 3 cards, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. He drew his replacements. His fingers, calloused from years of ranch work, trembled as he slowly fanned them out. Full house. Aces over jacks. A monster of a hand. The kind of hand that could save a man or get him killed. Rohr laid his cards down first. A straight, king high, a beautiful, powerful hand that would win 9 times out of 10. Rohr's smirk was triumphant. "Looks like your luck's run out for good, Turner." Eli took a slow breath, the smoky air burning his lungs. He laid his cards on the table, face up. The room fell silent. Roar's triumphant smirk didn't just falter, it shattered. His eyes went from smug to murderous in a heartbeat. The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. "Looks like the girl is yours," Roar finally hissed, his voice dripping with a venom that promised retribution. Eli stood, his legs unsteady. He hadn't won any money, but he hadn't lost everything. He had won a child. He pushed through the gawking crowd, the girl trailing behind him like a shadow. As they stepped out into the muddy street, into the cold, deadwood night, Eli couldn't shake a terrifying feeling. He looked over his shoulder. Through the grimy saloon window, he saw Clay Roar watching them go. And Roar wasn't angry. He was smiling. It was the smile of a man whose plan was working perfectly. The ride back to Silver Creek was silent and heavy. The wagon wheels groaned under the weight of the few supplies Eli had managed to buy on credit, a testament to his failure. Beside him sat Clarabelle, wrapped in his old canvas duster, looking like a scarecrow's ghost. She hadn't said a single word since they left the saloon. She just stared at the horizon, those wolf eyes scanning the rolling black hills as if expecting an ambush. "You always this quiet?" Eli finally asked, his voice rough. She turned her head slightly, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "Depends who's worth talking to." Eli let out a dry, humorless laugh. Fair enough. He'd won her in a card game. He'd stared down Clay Roar and walked away. By all accounts, he should feel relieved, maybe even proud. But he didn't. That smile on Roar's face haunted him. Why would a man like Roar, a man who controlled half of Deadwood, let a prize slip through his fingers over a single hand of poker? It didn't make sense. It felt wrong, like a trap he hadn't seen yet. "You worked for Roar long?" He tried again. "I worked near him," she corrected, her voice flat and cold. "Never for him." "What's the difference?" "The difference is, I'm still alive." Eli frowned. There was a story there, a dark one. The way she held herself, poised and ready to either fight or flee at a moment's notice. This wasn't just a runaway. This was a survivor. But a survivor of what? The casual cruelty of Deadwood? Or something much, much worse? As they crested a rise, the Silver Creek Ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A weathered house, a leaning barn, and fences that sagged like tired old men. The few cattle they had left looked like skeletons draped in hide. Seeing it through her eyes, Eli felt a fresh wave of shame. This is what he'd brought her to, a dying dream. The front door creaked open, and Rosalind stepped onto the porch. Her face was etched with worry, but it hardened the moment her eyes landed on Clarabelle. "Eli Turner," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "What in God's name have you done now?" "This is Clarabelle," Eli said, climbing down from the wagon. "She's... help!" "Help?" Rosalind's gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "She's a child. She's tougher than she looks," Eli muttered, not knowing how to explain the poker game, the desperation, the chilling feeling that Roar had played him like a fiddle. Clarabelle slid off the wagon, landing silently in the dirt. She looked up at Rosalind, her chin tilted in that defiant way of hers. The two of them stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. An exhausted ranch wife who'd had her heart broken by loss, and a street-tough girl who'd likely never known a moment of kindness. Then, the strangest thing happened. Clarabelle's hardened expression softened, just for a second. And in that second, she did something that sent a shiver down Eli's spine. She glanced over her shoulder, back toward the hills, back toward Deadwood. It wasn't a look of fear. It was a look of calculation. A look that said, "They won't find me here." And Eli understood. This wasn't a rescue. He hadn't won her. She had chosen him. She had used that poker game, used his desperation, as her own personal escape route. The trap hadn't been for him. It had been for Roar. And he and Rosalind had just walked right into the middle of it. The first few days were like living with a ghost. A small, wiry ghost who worked from sunup to sundown without a single complaint. Clarabelle mucked stalls, hauled water, and chopped wood with a grim efficiency that was unsettling in someone so young. She moved with a purpose that bordered on frantic, as if she believed that if she stopped working, something terrible would catch up to her. Rosalind, to her credit, tried. She showed Clarabelle how to mend clothes and bake cornbread. But her kindness was met with a wall of suspicion. Clarabelle took the food and the mended shirts, but she offered nothing of herself in return. She was a stone, polished smooth by a harsh world. Eli watched them both, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He'd brought a stranger into his home, a girl with a past as dark and tangled as the woods beyond their property line. What trouble had followed her here? He got his first hint a week later. He found her perched on the highest rail of the corral fence, staring out at the eastern ridge. She did this every morning and every evening, a silent, solitary vigil. "Storm's coming," Eli said, walking up beside her. "I know," she replied, not taking her eyes off the horizon. "I can smell it." It wasn't just the weather she was watching for. He knew it. "You expecting company?" She finally looked at him, those wolf eyes seeming to peer right into his soul. "In my life, Mr. Turner, company is never a good thing." "Eli," he corrected her, "and out here, we look after our own." A flicker of something, disbelief, maybe even a sliver of hope, crossed her face before the mask slammed back into place. "Nobody's ever looked after me but me." That night the storm broke. Rain hammered against the roof, and wind howled like a banshee. In the middle of the maelstrom, a loud crash came from the barn. Eli grabbed his old Winchester, his heart pounding. He found Clarabelle already there, holding a pitchfork like a spear, her back to the stalls, facing the large barn doors. A section of the roof had collapsed under the force of the wind, taking a heavy beam with it. It had crushed one of the empty stalls. If a horse had been in there, it would have been killed instantly. As Eli secured the damaged roof, he noticed something. Scuff marks in the mud near the main support beam. Fresh ones. And the beam itself, it hadn't just rotted through. He ran his hand along the wood. It was smooth. Too smooth. It had been sawed partway through. Deliberately. Someone had been on his ranch. Someone had sabotaged his barn, hoping the storm would finish the job and make it look like an accident. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was a message. A warning. He turned to look at Clarabelle. She was staring at the saw mark, her face pale in the lantern light. The fear was finally there, raw and undeniable in her wolf eyes. "It wasn't just messages I ran for Roar," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time since he'd met her. "Or his money. I handled his books, his ledgers." Eli's blood ran cold. He wasn't just a saloon owner, Eli. He was an investor. For powerful men back east. Men who want this whole valley. He kept a record of everything. Every bribe, every threat, every murder. It was my job to keep it hidden. She reached down and pulled up the leg of her trousers. Taped to her calf was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. "He doesn't know I can read or write. He thought I was just his little pet, his mascot. He never knew I made my own copy." She held out the package, the secret ledger, the reason Roar would burn the whole world down to get her back. He had thought his troubles were a dying ranch in a mountain of debt. He now realized he was standing in the middle of a war he didn't even know was being fought. The sabotaged barn wasn't a warning. It was the opening shot. The ledger was a time bomb. Eli held it in his hands, the small, leather-bound book feeling heavier than a bar of gold. Inside these pages, Clarabelle had said, were the names, dates, and crimes that connected Clay Roar to a web of corruption so vast it stretched all the way to the railroad barons and politicians in the East. And she had stolen it. "Why?" Rosalind asked, her voice a horrified whisper as they sat around the kitchen table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Why would you take something so dangerous?" Clarabelle's chin lifted, that familiar defiance returning. "Because it was the only chain he had on me. As long as he had it, I was his accountant, his secret keeper, his protégé." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Eli felt a surge of protective anger. He was beginning to understand the desperation that drove this child. She hadn't just run from a life of servitude. She had declared war on a king, and this ledger was her only weapon. "He's not just after the book," Clarabelle continued, her voice low and urgent. "This land, Silver Creek, It's not just a ranch. There's a surveyor's mark down by the creek bed. I saw it months ago. The new railroad. They plan to run the main line straight through this valley. Roar's job was to buy up all the land cheap, scare off anyone who wouldn't sell. It all clicked into place. The bank threatening to foreclose. The sudden bad luck that had plagued their cattle. It wasn't bad luck at all. It was a deliberate, calculated campaign to drive them off their land. Roar hadn't been trying to ruin Eli. He'd been trying to buy his future for pennies on the dollar. And the poker game, it was a masterstroke of cruelty. Roar hadn't cared about the $500. He'd seen a man at the end of his rope and offered him a way out, all the while knowing he was just tightening the noose. By giving him Clarabelle, he was placing his own biggest liability right in the hands of his target. He could solve two problems with one stone. Get his land and get his ledger back, all while letting Eli take the fall. But he'd made one fatal miscalculation. He'd underestimated the girl with wolf eyes. The next morning, Eli found fresh horse tracks down by the creek. Two riders by the look of it. They hadn't approached the house. They were scouting, watching. The siege had begun. "We can't stay here," Rosalind said, her hands twisting in her apron. "We have to run." "Run where?" Eli shot back, the frustration and fear making his voice sharp. "They want the whole valley. There's nowhere to go." "Then we fight," a small voice said. They both turned to look at Clarabelle. She stood in the doorway, her face set with a grim determination that made her look far older than her 13 years. "You don't know Roar," she said. "He doesn't leave loose ends. Running only makes you tired. You have to cut the snake's head off." Eli stared at her, a strange mix of horror and admiration swirling in his gut. This child was talking about war as if it were a chore, like mucking out a stall. But she was right. They were cornered. And cornered animals have only one option. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, his Winchester across his lap, watching the shadows. He was no stranger to violence. He'd been a gunslinger in his younger days, a fact he'd tried to bury when he'd met Rosalind. But the past, he was learning, had a way of digging itself out of the grave. Just before dawn, he saw it, a flicker of movement on the eastern ridge. Then another. They were coming. He woke Rosalind and Clarabelle. "Stay inside, bar the door, and don't come out no matter what you hear." Rosalind's face was pale, but she nodded, grabbing the old shotgun from above the mantel. She looked at Eli, her eyes filled with a love so fierce it almost broke his heart. "You come back," she ordered. Clarabelle, however, didn't move toward the house. She walked over to the woodpile and picked up a small hand axe, its weight seeming natural in her small grip. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice flat. "This is my fight, too." Before Eli could argue, the first shot cracked through the morning air, splintering the porch rail right next to his head. The raid was chaos, a storm of gunfire and shouting that shattered the morning peace. Eli saw at least 6 riders, led by a brute of a man he recognized as Jake Mallory, Roar's right hand. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were a hammer, meant to smash everything in their path. Eli returned fire from behind the water trough, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. He was a good shot, but he was badly outnumbered. Bullets chewed through the wood around him, sending splinters flying. He saw one of Mallory's men making a run for the barn, a torch in his hand. If they set the barn ablaze, it was over. He lined up his shot, squeezed the trigger, and his rifle clicked on an empty chamber. He fumbled for more cartridges, his hands slick with sweat. He wasn't going to make it. Suddenly, a shotgun blast roared from the house. "Rosalind!" The rider with the torch was thrown from his saddle, his chest a bloody ruin. Eli stared in shock. He'd seen his wife shoot at tin cans, but he'd never seen the cold, deadly focus she had in her eyes now. There was a part of her, he realized, that he didn't know at all. The brief distraction was enough. Eli reloaded and took down another rider. But they were still pushing forward, their numbers too great. Then from the side of the house, Clarabelle exploded into action. She moved like a phantom, a blur of motion. She didn't run at them head on. She used the terrain, ducking behind the woodpile, then the smokehouse. She threw the hand axe with a vicious accuracy that made Eli's jaw drop. It buried itself in the leg of a rider's horse, sending the animal screaming and rearing, throwing its rider to the ground. Before the man could recover, she was on him, a rock in her hand. It was brutal, primal. This wasn't a fight for land or money. For her, this was a fight for survival, and she fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. But even with their fierce resistance, the numbers were against them. Mallory and two of his men were closing in on the house. They were going to be overrun. And then another rifle shot echoed from the hills. But this one was different. It came from behind Mallory's men. One of the raiders crumpled from his saddle, then another shot. Another raider fell. Mallory's head snapped around, his face a mask of confusion and rage. Someone else was out there. Someone was helping them. Eli risked a look toward the northern ridge. A lone figure stood there, silhouetted against the rising sun. Even from this distance, Eli recognized the hat, the steady stance. Tom Bradley, his old ranch hand, a quiet man who'd retired a few years back to a small cabin in the hills. He'd always been a loyal friend, but this was something else. The shots were too precise, too professional for a simple rancher. The tide had turned. Facing a fight on two fronts, Mallory cursed, grabbed his wounded, and retreated back into the hills from which they came. Silence fell over Silver Creek, broken only by the smell of gunpowder and the panicked lowing of the cattle. The ground was littered with brass casings and blood. They had survived. But it wasn't a victory. It was a reprieve. Later that day, Tom Bradley rode down from the hills. His face was grim, the lines around his eyes deeper than Eli remembered. "You've kicked a hornet's nest, Eli," Tom said, his voice low. "Looks like you kicked it with me," Eli replied, his eyes filled with a question. "Those weren't the shots of a retired ranch hand, Tom." Tom sighed, a weary, soul-deep sound. He looked at Clarabelle, who was cleaning her hand axe with a quiet intensity, then at Roslyn, who was reloading the shotgun with practiced efficiency. "No," Tom admitted, his gaze meeting Eli's. "They weren't. Before I came here, I had another job. I was a U.S. Marshal." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. "I was part of a task force," Tom continued, his voice barely a whisper, "investigating railroad corruption. A man named Silas Blackwood. He's the money behind Roar. Untouchable. We got close, too close, and my partner was killed. The investigation was buried. They told me to retire, or I'd end up in a ditch myself. I came here to disappear, but it seems Blackwood's business has followed me." Eli finally understood. The stakes were even higher than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about his ranch. It was about a shadow war that had been raging for years. And his home, Silver Creek, was the new battlefield. He looked at his wife, a woman with a hidden strength he was just beginning to see. He looked at the girl he'd won in a card game, a child warrior forged in the fires of Deadwood. And he looked at his old friend, a retired lawman who had just revealed his own deadly secrets. This wasn't his family, not in any traditional sense. This was his army. The failed raid changed everything. The illusion of a simple rancher's life was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. They were an island, and the sharks were circling. Clay Roar and his boss, Silas Blackwood, wouldn't just let this go. They had shown their teeth, and now they would come back to finish the job. "We can't just wait for them to come back," Eli said, pacing the length of the kitchen. The adrenaline from the fight had worn off, leaving behind a cold, hard fear. "Next time, they'll send more men. They'll burn us to the ground." "Eli's right," Tom Bradley said, his martial instincts taking over. "A defensive position is a losing position. We have to take the fight to them." "How?" Roslyn asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're 3 adults and a child. They have an army of thugs." All eyes turned to Clarabelle. She was sitting at the table, running a sharpening stone along the edge of her hand axe. The rhythmic shing, 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 a counterpoint to the tense silence. "Roar has a weakness," she said without looking up. "Greed and paranoia. He trusts no one. His whole operation is built on fear. If we can make him think his partners are turning on him, he'll tear his own empire apart trying to find the traitor." A plan began to form, a wild, desperate gamble that was either brilliant or suicidal. They would use Roar's own weapon, the ledger, against him. But not the real one. For the next 2 days they worked. Guided by Clarabelle's encyclopedic knowledge of Roar's operations, In Tom's understanding of legal and financial documents, they created a forgery, a new ledger. This one was a work of art, filled with half-truths and clever lies. It detailed transactions that never happened, bribes paid to Roar's chief rivals, and secret deals that implicated everyone in his inner circle. Everyone except Silas Blackwood. We leave Blackwood's name out of it, Tom explained, his finger tracing a line of fake script. If Roar thinks Blackwood is coming after him, he'll run. But if he thinks he can cut out his rivals and consolidate power for Blackwood, he'll take the bait. And while he's busy cleaning his own house, Clarabelle added, a grim smile on her lips, he won't be watching us. The plan was to have Eli ride into Deadwood, not as a victim, but as a man looking to make a deal. He would offer to sell the ledger back to Roar, claiming he had no stomach for the fight and just wanted to be left alone. It was a dangerous role to play. One wrong move, one flicker of doubt in his eyes, and Roar would see right through it. Before he left, Rosalind pulled him aside. She pressed a small pearl-handled derringer into his hand. I've had this for years, she said, her voice low. My father gave it to me. I never thought I'd have a reason to use it. She looked him dead in the eye. Don't let them take you alive, Eli. The ride into Deadwood was the longest of Eli's life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. He felt like a man walking to his own hanging. He found Roar at the Silver Ace, holding court like a king on a throne of whiskey barrels. The moment Eli walked in, the saloon went silent. Roar's eyes, cold and reptilian, locked onto him. Turner, Roar sneered. I'm surprised you have the guts to show your face here. I should have your head on a platter for what you did to my men. Eli kept his face a mask of weary resignation. I'm not here for a fight, Roar. I'm here to make a deal. He pulled the forged ledger from his coat and tossed it onto the table. This is what you want. Take it. Just call off your dogs. My ranch, my family, we're not worth the trouble. Roar stared at the book, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of suspicion and triumph. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the leather cover. He slowly opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. Eli's heart hammered in his chest. Had they made a mistake? Was the forgery not good enough? A slow, cruel smile spread across Roar's face. He saw the names of his rivals, the fabricated betrayals. He saw a path to even greater power. He saw exactly what they wanted him to see. You're a coward, Turner, Roar chuckled, the sound oily and triumphant. But you're a smart coward. You've got a deal. He slid the ledger into his coat. Now get out of my town. If I ever see you or that little wolf bitch again, I'll skin you both. Eli didn't wait to be told twice. He backed out of the saloon, his hand never far from the derringer Rosalind had given him. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, the feeling of Roar's eyes on his back like a physical weight. He had done it. The trap was set. But as he rode into the hills, a new, chilling thought crept into his mind. The deal had been too easy. Roar was a predator, a man who lived for the hunt. Predators don't just let their prey walk away, even when they get what they want. Eli had a sickening feeling that he hadn't just set a trap for Roar. He had walked into one himself. Roar hadn't been fooled by the fake ledger. He had wanted Eli to bring it to him. He had wanted Eli to believe he had won. Because now Roar knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Not a simple rancher, but a man who would scheme, who would fight back. A man who needed to be exterminated, not just scared off. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a deadlier phase. For a few weeks, an eerie peace settled over Silver Creek. A false peace. Eli knew it, Tom knew it, and Clarabelle, with her constant vigil of the horizon, definitely knew it. Roar was quiet. Too quiet. Like the unnerving calm before a tornado touches down. They used the time to prepare. Tom, drawing on his martial training, turned the ranch into a defensible fortress. They dug trenches, reinforced the barn walls, and set up fallback positions. Rosalind stockpiled medical supplies and canned goods, turning the root cellar into a bunker. But it was Clarabelle who orchestrated their most clever defenses. She thought not like a soldier, but like a street fighter. She taught them how to create diversions, how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to set traps that were simple but brutally effective. Under her tutelage, the gullies and creek beds around the ranch were turned into a network of snares and deadfalls. During this time, something shifted between them. The lines of rancher, lawman, and street rat blurred. They became a single unit, a family forged in the face of a common enemy. One evening, Eli and Rosalind sat Clarabelle down at the kitchen table. With Tom as a witness, they presented her with adoption papers, drawn up by a sympathetic judge in a neighboring county. "You're not just help," Rosalind said, her eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. "You're not a prize we won. You're our daughter, if you'll have us." For the first time since he'd met her, Eli saw Clarabelle's armor crack completely. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, a small jerky movement, and for the first time she looked like what she was, a child who had finally found a home. The quiet was shattered a month later. A lone rider appeared on the road, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. It wasn't one of Roar's men. This man was gaunt, his face pale with sickness or fear. He slumped from his saddle as Eli and Tom approached, rifles raised. "You're Turner?" the man rasped, his eyes wild. Eli nodded. I was one of Roar's bookkeepers." The man coughed, a fleck of blood on his lips. "He found out I was skimming, but before he dealt with me, he was bragging." The man's story tumbled out in a panicked rush. The forged ledger had worked exactly as they'd planned. Roar had gone on a rampage, brutally eliminating his rivals and seizing their assets. He'd consolidated all the criminal enterprises in the territory under his sole control. He was more powerful now than ever before. "He didn't fall for your trick," the man wheezed, his breath growing shallow. "He used it. He used you to do his dirty work for him. And now there's no one left to stand in his way." The dying bookkeeper grabbed Eli's shirt, his eyes wide with terror. "That's not the worst of it. He sent a wire to his boss, to Blackwood. He told him the valley was clear. Blackwood is coming. He's taking the train from Chicago himself. He's bringing a private army, a dozen Pinkerton detectives, the best guns money can buy. They're not coming to scare you off. They're coming to wipe Silver Creek off the map, to make an example of you." The man collapsed, his last breath a rattling sigh. Eli stood there, the man's final warning echoing in his ears. They hadn't tricked the devil. They had just handed him a sharper sword. Their clever plan had been nothing more than a fool's gambit, a single move in a much larger, deadlier game. And now the real monster, Silas Blackwood, was on his way. This wasn't a gang of thugs coming for them anymore. This was the full, wrathful power of the railroad, a force that had tamed a continent. They weren't just fighting for their ranch now. They were standing in the way of progress, in the way of history. And history, Eli knew, had a way of crushing anything that stood in its path. The news of Blackwood's impending arrival cast a long, dark shadow over the ranch. This was the endgame. They couldn't run, and they couldn't hide. All they could do was prepare for a war they had almost no chance of winning. A grim resolve settled over the family. The fear was still there, a cold knot in their stomachs, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. This was their home. They had built it, bled for it, and they would not let it be taken without a fight that would be spoken of for generations. In the years that followed that first raid, something unexpected had happened. The story of the small ranch that stood up to Clay Roar had spread. Whispers traveled through the territory, carried by freighters and prospectors. Silver Creek became a symbol of defiance, and it began to attract the lost and the broken. The first was a boy named Daniel, a 10-year-old orphan who'd run from the brutal conditions of the Deadwood mines. Eli found him sleeping in the hayloft and was ready to send him on his way, but Clarabelle stopped him. "He's me," she had said, her voice quiet but firm. "5 years ago." So Daniel stayed. Then came Ruth, a girl with old eyes and bruises she tried to hide. Then 2 brothers, Thomas and Sam, who had been abandoned by their family on the trail west. One by one they arrived. Orphans, runaways, children discarded by a harsh world. Silver Creek Ranch ceased to be just a ranch. It became a sanctuary, a refuge. And Clarabelle, now a young woman of 18, became their leader. She taught them what she knew, how to survive. But she taught them more than that. She taught them how to work, how to trust, how to belong. The children weren't just mouths to feed. They were part of the ranch. They mended fences, tended the cattle, and stood watch on the ridges. They were Clarabelle's army, an army of the forgotten. When the news of Blackwood's army came, it was this family, this tribe of outcasts that rallied. Daniel, now a strapping 16-year-old, became Clarabelle's lieutenant. Ruth, with her sharp eyes, became their chief scout. They knew every rock, every tree, every inch of their land. The day the army arrived was bright and clear, a beautiful spring day for a war. They came not as a disorganized mob, but as a disciplined force. 24 men clad in the dusters of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, led by a man in a fine city suit who rode a magnificent black stallion. Silas Blackwood. At his side, smirking with triumph, was Clay Roar. They stopped at the edge of the property line, a line of cold-eyed killers ready to unleash hell. Blackwood raised a hand, and a man with a bugle played a sharp military call. It was a formal declaration of war, but Silver Creek was ready. From hidden positions in the hills, from the barn loft, from the trenches, a volley of rifle fire answered the bugle call. The battle for Silver Creek had begun. The fight was a blur of noise and fury. Blackwood's men were professionals, and they advanced with cold precision. But they had underestimated their opponents. They were expecting a rancher, his wife, and a handful of strays. They were not expecting a coordinated, fierce defense from every direction. The children, using their small size and knowledge of the land, were like ghosts. They led the Pinkertons into Clarabelle's traps, harassed their flanks, and then vanished back into the landscape. Ruth's scouting reports, relayed by a series of coded bird calls, gave Tom and Eli the information they needed to anticipate the enemy's movements. For 2 days, the siege raged. The ranch house was riddled with bullet holes. The barn was smoldering from a fire they'd barely managed to put out. But they held. They were bruised, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. But they had not broken. On the 3rd day, Roar, frustrated by the lack of progress, led a desperate charge on the barn himself, hoping to break their defenses once and for all. It was the moment Clarabelle had been waiting for. She met him inside the smoke-filled barn. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a reckoning. They circled each other in the gloom, knives in hand. Her former mentor, the man who had shaped her, who had tried to own her, and the girl who had refused to be a victim. The fight was swift and brutal. Roar was stronger, but Clarabelle was faster, fueled by years of pent-up rage and a desperate need to protect her home. She moved like a phantom, her movements economical and deadly. She ended it with a move he had taught her himself, disarming him and putting her blade to his throat. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a strange mix of shock, anger, and something else. Something that looked disturbingly like pride. "Why?" she gasped, pressing the blade harder. "Why were you so obsessed with me? The ledger wasn't worth all this." Roar let out a choked, gurgling laugh. "It was never about the ledger, girl," he rasped, a bloody smile on his lips. "You think I'd put my most valuable secret in the hands of some random street rat?" He looked at her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I put it in the hands of my daughter." The world stopped. The knife fell from her hand. "Your mother? She died when you were born." Roar coughed, the life draining from him. "I couldn't keep you, not in my world. So I hid you in plain sight, in the one place no one would ever look for my blood. I put you in that poker game. I rigged it for Turner to win. I thought a simple rancher would be easy to control. A safe place to keep you until I was ready." His eyes fluttered. "My greatest treasure and my greatest mistake." He collapsed, the confession hanging in the air like gunpowder smoke. Clarabelle stood frozen, the revelation a wound far deeper than any knife could make. Her entire life, her entire identity, had been a lie. But there was no time to process it. A loud explosion from the direction of the house shook her from her stupor. Blackwood, seeing his forces faltering, had resorted to dynamite. The final battle was at hand. Eli and Tom, seeing the main house was about to be overrun, led the last of their fighters in a desperate final charge. They slammed into Blackwood's flank, a wild, chaotic maneuver that took the disciplined Pinkertons by surprise. In the ensuing chaos, Eli found himself face to face with Silas Blackwood. The railroad baron was a man used to fighting his battles in boardrooms, not in the dirt and blood of a ranch yard. He was clumsy with his pistol, his eyes wide with the panic of a man who had lost control. Eli, the tired rancher, the man who had just wanted to be left in peace, disarmed him with an ease that surprised even himself. He pressed the barrel of his Winchester under the rich man's chin. "This is my home," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "and you are not welcome here." The fight was over. The surviving Pinkertons, seeing their leader captured, threw down their weapons. The army had been defeated. In the aftermath, they stood amidst the wreckage of their home. The ranch was battered, scarred, but it was still standing. The family, this strange collection of broken souls, was bruised and wounded, but they were alive, and they were together. The authorities, alerted by a message Tom had managed to send out before the siege, arrived to take Blackwood and his men into custody. The full weight of his crimes, now exposed, would bring his empire crashing down. A few days later, Clarabelle stood on the porch, looking out over the valley. Eli came and stood beside her. "He told me," she said, her voice hollow. "Roar. He was my father." Eli was silent for a long moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders. "A man who plants a seed ain't a gardener, Clara," he said softly. "The one who waters it, who tends it, who gives it a place to grow. He's the gardener. Clay Roar might have been your father, but I'm your dad." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the second time in her life, she cried. Tears not of sorrow, but of release. She had faced her past, she had fought her demons, and she had won. Silver Creek Ranch was more than just a sanctuary now. It was a legend, a story whispered across the West, of the family of strays who stood against a king and built a home. They showed the world that the West wasn't just won by guns and greed, but by the quiet, stubborn courage of ordinary people who refused to be broken. If you enjoyed this story of grit, family, and the wild, untamed heart of the American West, don't forget to like and subscribe to Wild West Stories. There's always another legend riding in on the next win, and you won't want to miss it. Keep your hat close and your heart open. We'll be right here waiting for you.